So when it comes to GameMaker's asynchronous buffer save and load functions, there's both good news and bad news. The bad news is that they suck. The good news is that in GameMaker's upcoming feature runtime GMRT, they should be streamlined a little bit and they should suck less. And the other bad news is that assuming you want to finish your game before then, assuming you want to finish your game using GameMaker's current runtime, especially if you want to deploy your game on certain platforms and more especially consoles, you're going to have to use GameMaker's asynchronous buffer save and load functions anyway. Hello all the crazy people out there, my name is Michael, I like wizards and dragons and making games, and I have been putting off this video for years and years and years because I didn't want to deal with asynchronous buffer save and load functions, but people keep asking me to cover them, and because I have a hole in my upload schedule this week, I decided I might as well just get it over with. So buffers, most of you are probably familiar with these. Buffers are basically just like unspecialized blocks of memory that you can allocate in your game and you can do kind of whatever you want with. You can like write arbitrary data to them. You can use them to like save and load players, save data from the disk, which is probably what most people use them for most of the time. They have a set of functions for synchronously saving and loading the contents of a buffer to the disk. And because that is what I anticipate most people using these for most of the time, let's go and create a little example for that. So I'm going to go into the player step event and I'm going to say if keyboard check pressed, let's say if you hit the P key, and the main reason I choose that is because it's on the other side of the keyboard for most of my other keyboard inputs and the risk of hitting it by accidentally is fairly low. We can say var save data is going to be, I'm just going to stuff x obj player.x, y obj player.y, and dir obj player.anim direction into a struct. We're just going to save and load the player's position. This isn't going to be anything fancy. We can say var save JSON is going to be JSON stringify, which is one of my favorite function names in all computing ever. Save data, that's going to turn this struct into a JSON string. We can say var buffer equals buffer create. I'm going to initialize this to a size of 1. I'm going to give it a type of buffer grow so that it'll resize to accommodate whatever data we put in it. And I'm just going to give it an alignment of 1. Exactly how you, like, what the different buffer settings do. I made a video on buffers a long time ago. I'm kind of assuming that if you're watching this video, you already know the basics of buffers, but I'll have it linked anyway. Anyway, we can buffer right into the save buffer. Buffer type can be buffer text, and the value can be the save JSON as text. We can buffer save. I'm going to save this buffer to a file, which I'm just going to call save.dat. And we can buffer delete the buffer when we're done with it. And that's going to be our very rudimentary save system. If I wanted to load this out, we could do basically the same thing in reverse. So if I were to hit, instead of the P key, how about the O key right next to it? We could first check if file exists. Because if we try to load a file that doesn't exist, GameMaker is going to shake its fist at us. We can say our buffer equals buffer load save.dat. We could say save JSON equals buffer read from the buffer text. Var save data equals JSON parse, which unfortunately isn't quite as funny of a name as JSON stringify. Save JSON. We can delete we can delete the source buffer because we're done with it, and we don't need it taking up space in memory any longer. And next we can say with obj player, which is the scope that this code is running in anyway, so it might be a little redundant, but whatever. X equals save data.x, y equals save data.y, anim dir equals save data.dir, like that. And that should be it for our rudimentary save and load system. That took like 3 minutes to write. I'm just going to walk off into this corner. We can face upward, I suppose, because we're going to save our position and direction. If I were to walk off somewhere else in the room, if I hit the O key, we are going to reload the file that we saved. And if we were to go into GameMaker's local storage, where it saves files by default, if I were to go look for the folder that would have been created with this one, what would it have been? Tutorial buffer async. We've got a little file here called save.dat. If I were to open this up in like Notepad++ or something, we're going to have the properties that we wrote out. If I were to use the fancy JSON formatter Notepad extension, then we can format it a little bit nicer. I believe there's also a pretty print option in the JSON stringify function for GameMaker now. But anyway, that is synchronously saving and loading buffers in GameMaker. So when you call the buffer save function, it will be saved immediately, or relatively immediately, disk speeds notwithstanding, and then it'll finish before the next line of code executes anyway. When you call buffer load, same thing. It will load the file. It will pause execution in the game until it's finished doing that. Disk speeds be damned. If you are running your game off a spinny mechanical hard drive, sorry. And this is fine for light use. If you're only deploying your game to desktop computers, so Windows, Mac, Linux, then this generally won't be a problem. If we set aside the fact that if you like try to load a really big file at once, your game might hitch while it does that. Certain other platforms that you might try to put your game on, HTML5 comes to mind. HTML5 is very particular about this. Consoles come to mind. You can't really do this, and you're going to instead, if you want to create a save and load system for your game, you're going to instead have to use the asynchronous buffer functions. And the asynchronous buffer functions will, when you call the buffer save and load functions using them, they will not necessarily finish the operation immediately. They may or may not take a little bit longer, or depending a lot longer, to finish what they're doing before you can proceed. So I'm going to start off by commenting out this block of code. I'm going to leave it here so that when you when I put the code on GitHub, you can just cross-reference it. So I'm going to start by saying when I hit the P key on the keyboard, we're going to do all the things we did before. We're going to assemble our save data into a bit of JSON like this. We're going to write the JSON string into the buffer, and instead of saying buffer save, buffer and save.dat, we're going to say buffer save async. And this is going to take a couple of extra arguments, which really are going to just be the starting address in the buffer that you want to save and the size of the buffer that you want to save. 0 and, in my case, buffer tell, or perhaps buffer get size should be fine. Can you say 0 and -1 for the entire buffer? Anyway, when you save a buffer asynchronously in GameMaker, it's not that bad. This isn't really where the headache comes in. At least not where most of the headache comes in. I'm going to run this, and we're going to see what file it spits out. So again, let me just walk over down here into the corner. Let me hit the P key on the keyboard. Let me close the game, and let me go into the save area where GameMaker saves its local storage files. And we're going to see that this actually wasn't one-to-one analogous to the synchronous buffer save and load function that we did earlier. So save.dat is still here. This is our save file from a few minutes ago, where buffer save async actually stored the file is in this folder called default. And this is kind of its own whole can of worms. By default, GameMaker will save asynchronously saved buffers in a folder in the save area called default. You can change the name of this folder. I will get to that later, but it's something you might want to keep in mind when you do asynchronous file saving and loading. Now, going the other way, this is where things are going to start to suck a little bit more. So I can say, so when we hit the O key on the keyboard, we can again check to see if the file exists. Because GameMaker will put buffer async save and load files in a folder named default, I'm going to want to, at least for now, specify that file when we check to see if the file exists. When we say buffer load async, so when we do our asynchronous buffer load, we are going to need a few things. So one is going to be that we're going to need to actually create a buffer for the data to load into beforehand, and it's going to need to be basically an instance variable. for the object that's doing the loading. I am going to say, let's call it load buffer. And we can, let's do this inside, like, where you hit the OK. Buffer create. I'm going to initialize this to a size of, like, I don't know, 100 should be good. We can specify its type to be buffer grow just in case it needs to be bigger. Yes, Feather is yelling at me because I'm not initializing this in the create event, which is another part of the headache, to be honest. Buffer load async can take the load buffer ID that we just created here. The file name can be save.dat. This is going to be the name of the file inside the default folder. The offset can be 0, and I believe I can just specify -1 on this one to make it load the whole thing. Alright, it doesn't say, but I know I've done that in the past, so we're going to operate under the assumption that we can do that. I'm also going to need load buffer async ID. I'm also going to need to save the result of this buffer load function to another variable. Instead of having it return the buffer itself, it is going to return an async load ID. And that's going to be another thing that we're going to want to initialize in, well, somewhere. This probably, if we want Feather to stop yelling at us, should go in the create event. Just a generally good code practice, like that. And the rest of this code here, where we actually, like, parse the JSON and whatnot, that's not going to happen here in this event. When we say keyboard check pressed or O. That is going to happen in a completely different event, which is going to be, if we go into the object which is calling this code, we can say asynchronous save load down here close to the bottom. This is all going to happen in here, in this event. So there's a couple things that we'll need. One is going to be, well, I guess we'll need this too. That wasn't where I was going with this, but we're going to need the load buffer and the load buffer async ID that we established earlier. This is because whenever you do a buffer load async in GameMaker, or for that matter a buffer save async, it will emit an async save load event like this. And if you are potentially loading a bunch of files at once, or even loading a bunch of files not at once but just over the course of the game, you are going to need a way to keep them straight. So let's go and full screen this code window, so that we've got a little more space. And the way that we are going to make sure that we can tell which buffer that you load is which is, there is a built-in variable that only works in the async events, and that's going to be async load. This is going to be a DS map, and when it comes to saving and loading buffers, it can contain a few values. One is going to be, if you use the DS map accessor, the ID of the buffer, and the ID of the buffer is going to, for example, correspond to the, like this, the load buffer here that we created and that we, like, told the async load function to load the data into. And another is going to be async load DS map accessor status. And this is going to be a true or false depending on whether or not it successfully saved or loaded it, whether or not it successfully completed its operations. So let's see, we can say if async load accessor ID equals the load buffer. Actually, that's going to be load buffer async ID, I'm sorry. Like this. Then we can start doing some things. We might want to check if async load accessor status equals false, then we might want to, like, emit an error message. Like this, and then just return out of it because there's nothing to load. And once we've established, like, which async operation that we're looking at here in this async save load event, now we can actually start doing something with this data. So let me uncomment this, and we can say, instead of buffer read out of some variable that doesn't exist anymore, we can buffer read out of the load buffer. We might as well delete that when we're done with it as well. And this is where we can actually do our load player state operation. Let's see, just for good practice so that this works more than once, let me actually initialize load buffer to -1, and let me buffer create it down here in the when you hit the O key on the keyboard. That's how it was set up in my test project, but I think I cut and pasted too many lines of code earlier. Do I want to print out a status message if if you successfully load the file too? I guess I will. Let's show a message. Successfully loaded the save. I mean, it should be pretty obvious, honestly, that you successfully loaded the save when you know, see your player's location change to where you saved. So let me just stand up here. Let me hit the P key. Let me wander off somewhere else. Hit the O key. Successfully loaded the save. That's pretty cool. And we have officially made use of buffer async save load like this. All right, that was not a lot of fun. And I mean, it works. And once you understand what GameMaker wants you to do with the async buffer event and whatnot, it's like not the worst thing in the world. But the fact that you have to do it at all, and the fact that you can't just like pass a callback function to the buffer load async function like basically every other programming environment in history ever, it's a little annoying. So this is the reason that it's like this is because this is a holdover from very old, like the GMS1 days before function callbacks are really like a thing you could do. And when 2.3 rolled around and like anonymous functions became part of, you know, the GameMaker vocabulary, the async buffer save and load functions just never caught up. And that really makes me sad because they really are kind of a pain to use like this. Like I suggested at the beginning of the video, hopefully in GMRT, you will be able to just pass a callback function to something resembling a buffer load async function, so you'll just be able to say, like, you know, something like this. But that day is not today. People have made wrapper libraries and things of that nature to make the GameMaker buffer async functions a little bit more friendly, but I'm generally in favor of people learning why things are the way they are before they jump into the substitutes. So, let's see, what else? I should be able to actually get rid of the check for if the file exists when we load the async buffer, because if the file doesn't exist or if it fails to load for any other reason, instead of just, like, either crashing or spitting out garbage data, I can't remember which one GameMaker will do currently with synchronous buffer load, that is one of the things that will cause the status in the async load DS map to return false. So if I were to, let's just go into Windows Explorer and like delete this, right? Delete the save file. And if I were to try and hit the O key, really? Wait, GameMaker, did you really load the old one too? You're not supposed to do that. God, what is this engine? Why am I using this engine? Let's try that again. All right. If we hit the O key, when there doesn't exist a save file, we will just get a message that says, oh no, failed to load, triple exclamation mark. And that is, you know, the result of this check up here. So I guess that's nice that you don't have to do like a bunch of file exist checks before doing this, but I don't know, man. Let's see, what else do I want to talk about? There's a few other things. So you can also receive async save load events when you save a buffer as well as loading it. And let me go and initialize like save buffer async ID down here. And for this we can say save buffer async ID equals the return value of buffer save async. And we could put a second block of code down here and we could say if async load ID equals save buffer async ID. And instead of like doing all this junk with loading the save file that doesn't exist, we can say like if the status is false, we can say, oh no, failed to save, is your disk full or something? Because that's really the only reason I could think of that this function would really fail is if your disk is full. Else we can just like I don't know, print out something. Print out something a little bit more like cheerful down here at the bottom, and we can also receive buffer save async events like this. This isn't something that I really do like normally. I guess it's probably that was not the P key. That was the P key. We can see that when I hit the P key, it said game saved successfully. It would probably be a little bit more important to do something like this if you're making a game on console. Like, because console makers usually like to have the game inform the player when things like this go wrong. If you, for example, run out of storage space. I am not going to create a situation to test where this actually happens because I don't really want to fill up my disk with, like, garbage data. but can be worth knowing that that function is there. Next, so about the default folder. I said that, at least I think I said you can rename this to something else if you really want to. And that could come in handy if you have, like, multiple character profiles in one game on one user account. Like, if you think of a game like Skyrim and you can create multiple characters and they'll be stored in, like, different, like, groups of save files, you can create a, like, you can group save files together by the player name or something. And we could use a function that's, off the top of my head, what is it? Buffer async group begin. And this is going to allow us to set our async group name. So instead of default, we can say like buffer async group begin duck, buffer async group end. I apparently did not copy paste function name. Buffer async group end, which doesn't take any function names. And this is going to have us save our, let me go and delete all this, everything in there, so that we can see it like a clean version. I'm going to also do this when we load, so when I buffer load async, we can say buffer async group begin player name duck, or I guess group name duck, and then when we're done, buffer async group end. Let me go and run this now. I am going to go wander off somewhere, hit the P key to save. And we are going to... Did I not hit the P key to save? Hey, real fast, it's me from the future. So the reason that my code was not working as initially written is because when you use the buffer async group begin and end functions to like create save profiles and whatever, you need to use not the return value of the buffer load or save async functions themselves. As the async group ID, you need to use the return value of the buffer async group end function as the async load ID, as the async save load ID. And now if I do this... Wait a minute, why do I not have, like... GameMaker? Alright, F5 still works. Anyway, if I were to do this and run the game, let's go and wander off into some random corner. Let's hit the P key to save. That's going to do its thing. And I can go and wander off to the other corner. I can hit the O key to load, and now it's going to work. So when you use buffer async group begin and end, don't use the buffer save or buffer load async functions themselves as the return value. Use the buffer async group end function as the return value for the save ID. I realize that this makes it even more weird and complicated and roundabout of a system than it already was. I really cannot wait until GMRT comes on in and attempts to clean up the mess. I definitely appreciate the intent behind the buffer async group begin like features, so that you can create little save profiles like this, but the way that they're implemented is really weird. So I hope my complaining in this video doesn't make it come across sounding like asynchronous buffer saving and loading is a bad idea, because it's not. It is definitely a good idea. I just think that GameMaker's implementation of it is, like, not very good. The obvious reason that you would want to do something like asynchronous buffer saving and loading is that if you have like a save file that's maybe a couple of megabytes in size, a fairly large save file, you probably at least don't want your game to take a couple millisecond hitch when you vacuum that off the disk, or also when you write it to the disk, especially if you have like an autosave system of some sort. Players probably wouldn't really appreciate that. Arguably, even more importantly than that, is that on certain platforms, HTML5 and console, I believe, are the big ones. The async buffer save and load functions also do a couple of other things in the background, like on platforms where there's a lot of limitations and rules and regulations as to where you're allowed to write data, where and how you're allowed to write data. The buffer load async functions will do a couple of other things, I want to say involving like device permissions and things of that nature. I can't remember off the top of my head everything that they do, and in any case, console development tends to be a little bit NDA happy, and like if I did actually sign an NDA for Sony, I don't think I'd really be allowed to get that much deeper into it. So keep that in mind if that is something that is going to be relevant to your game's future. So is there anything else? I think that's about it for asynchronous buffer saving and loading. Alright, I'm gonna end this off here. My name is Michael. This has been Asynchronous Buffer Saving and Loading in GameMaker. If you want the code for this, look for the GitHub repository down in the video description. I like to post videos on weird stuff you can do in GameMaker. I wish the async events in GameMaker didn't qualify as weird, but here we are. You should all go check out Wizarducks and the Lost Hat, which is the game that I like to work on when I'm not doing YouTube stuff. Link to the Steam page can be found down below. I have a Patreon, so if you want to contribute to the channel, links to that can be found in all the usual places as well. I hope you all found this useful, and I will see you all later. Special thanks to DJ Gibbles, Edward Holt, GameMaker, Ganymede Ghost, Manta Ray, Spydog Games, Squarecrow, VitroV, and Zengiment for supporting these videos. If you feel inclined to support the channel, head on over to the Patreon page down in the video description to join the fun.